Having completed my conversion of some basic Black Templar units, I wanted to follow them up with some more decorated troops and more in-depth conversion. Where the Crusader squad was mostly larger part swapping and attaching decorations, this time I wanted to make more custom parts, cutting up and reassembling multiple different bits, along with making use of more materials like green stuff. The base kit I started with are some Bladeguard veterans, and also a Bladeguard lieutenant that I still had spare. This type of unit is great for Black Templar conversions, with some nice details already modelled on, their sword focus, and even already having tabards. This Bladeguard kit is also multi-part, which means there's a few different weapon options to choose from, and parts come a bit more separated. This makes it easier to find better parts for the conversion ideas I have in mind, and it'll also leave me with more leftovers to use in future builds too. The details I'd be adding are also partially inspired by some recent Warhammer things, like Space Marine 2 and the Secret Level episode, along with some classics I always think look good and some favourite 40k art of mine. I started off the way I usually do, building the minimum version of the kit, here just the legs and torso, so I could play around and test out the other parts to see how well they worked with the bigger ideas I had in mind. I often look to Mark Gibbons' art for inspiration. He has a great set of Black Templar designs which inspired a previous batch of Bladeguards, but I also really like his Ultramarine Tyranid Hunter designs, and wanted to incorporate some elements of those. Specifically, I thought this dual chainsword would be cool, so I cut up and trimmed down some spare chainswords, glued them back to back, and used it to replace the sword of one of the Bladeguards. For another unit, seeing some Bladeguards tear through Chaos Cultists in the Secret Level episode made me want to do something inspired by that, and Materis' dual power axe was an obvious choice. I had a few spare power axes from other Black Templar kits, but they were all single-sided, but I was able to cut the blade off of one to attach the other, and also did the same thing to some of the decorative parts to keep it symmetrical. Then I did the same thing as the chainsword, where I replaced the sword on one of the Bladeguard's arms with it. I did pin both of these weapons, that is, drilling a small hole into both parts to glue a wire into, as it provides a sturdier connection than only plastic glue, especially given that just plastic glue wouldn't work well with the little surface area these parts were connected by. Then I gave those two their shields and heads, just swapping one out for a Mark 7 to match the art and for some nice variety, before moving on to sorting out the big parts of the other two minis. One unit I wanted to be inspired by Space Marine 2, and I played a lot of the Bulwark class, which is basically a Bladeguard, but with a bit of an ancient, being able to use a banner, and I figured that would be a cool thing to incorporate. So I built one with the sword in the offhand, and for the banner arm, I used one that normally holds a pistol, but just cut the actual weapon off and drilled a hole in to later put the banner into. Then, an extra unit that makes sense to go along with the squad is a Bladeguard lieutenant I had mostly spare. I say mostly because I used his Volkite weapon on a Scutari and his shield on a Terminator, but the body is still a good starting point, and I have plenty of spare parts to rebuild it with. I like the Volkite weapon, and the Bladeguard kit did have some spare parts for those I hadn't used, so I cut most of a bolt pistol off of a held out arm, and got the handle of the Volkite pistol to glue the two parts together. Then for the unit's other arm, I already had one of those same models I built normally, so I wanted to give him another weapon instead of the shield. For some variety with the rest of the unit's bladed weapons, I used a Power Maul piece taken from a Sisters of Battle warsuit. And being inspired by some Mark Gibbons art, I liked the look of it being held downwards. So I dug through my bits box until I found an arm that mostly fit that position I could swap the weapon out for, but it still required cutting at the wrist to twist it at the right angle. It was a Firstborn Marine's arm from the old Black Templar upgrade kit, and the cut was a little rough, but I could rely on chains and another detail I had in mind to cover it up later. And to return to the banner holder, I used another piece from the old upgrade kit, which I pinned to some plasticard rod. If you are looking for a similar piece but actually still in production, there are a few kits with them like the Primaris Ancient, Company Heroes or the 30k Command Squad. But for my units, those were the main bodies and biggest parts sorted, so I could move on to giving them the rest of the parts from their kit, and add a few details myself. Going back to the dual chainsword unit, I wanted to continue on in the style of the Tyranid Hunters. They kind of relate to the old Ultramarines Tyrannic War veterans a little, and they sometimes use slayed Tyranid pieces as kill trophies or extra armour. But the only recent things they've done are this Phobos Lieutenant from the Leviathan box, and a shoulder pad in Space Marine 2. To make something like that myself, I grabbed some bits from the old Skulls kit, the new Battlefield Trophies kit, and also got a Termagant, which I cut down until I had just a few pieces like its armour plates. I armoured up the right arm with the Termagant pieces, and used the dead Tyranid head as a backpack topper. Putting it all together, along with the rest of the armour, it was a bit bulky, and it might be the recent hours in Monster Hunter taking influence, but I like the look of it. I also used some Tamiya masking tape, cut into roughly 1mm strips, to act as straps connecting the Tyranid armour. Green stuff would also work for this, maybe even a little better, but I wanted to test out using tape and compare it with the other green stuff I'd be adding later. As mentioned before, this is more of an Ultramarines thing, so it might not be that appropriate for Black Templars, but it was a cool design element I wanted to try out. For the axe wielder, I found after all the normal Bladeguard parts, he was already quite detailed. The only extras I gave him were some shield decorations. Taking inspiration from a Bladeguard Captain model that also showed up in Space Marine 2, I dug through my bits collection until I found some human skeleton parts, to act as some kind of honoured dead, which I just glued on and wrapped up with chains. For the standard bearer, I had a few plans for green stuff additions later, so for now I just gave him a fancier iron halo by incorporating part of a relic skull piece from the Sword Brethren kit. And for the lieutenant, I grabbed whatever spare shoulder pads I had, and to make him stand out compared to the regular Bladeguard squad, I cut off his iron halo to use it more like an actual halo on his helmet, and just replace where it would be on his power pack with a lantern bit. Then I gave them the standard chains around their weapons, and anything else that needed it, like the dead Nid head on the hunter, and I could move on to the green stuff. It's not something I do a lot, and only have a little practice with, but it can give some great results. It works particularly well with softer stuff that needs to fit around and conform to the model, like wires and fabrics. I'm no sculptor, so most of the time I have a few tricks and techniques that allow me to avoid some of the more involved sculpting stuff. I use water to stop it sticking. I always have a small pot of it on my desk when using green stuff, that I frequently dip my fingers and tools into, and I also drop a little on my work surface. I make sure to work on a clean and flat surface. I just use a cutting mat that I wipe down with paint thinner. When I make any type of clothes or fabric thing, I roll the green stuff out flat and copy clothing sewing patterns, so I mostly just need to lay it on the model and gently push it into place instead of sculpting. I roll it out with some large paintbrush handles that I know are smooth, and I also use some rubber tipped tools which make it easier to push stuff into place without smushing it or leaving marks. And those tools also allow me to brush out the green stuff to smooth it further if needed. There are a few things I set out to make with green stuff for these models. First up were some twisted rope type of details, where I rolled the putty out into thin wires, got two next to each other and twisted them by the edges. For these I found it was better to let the wires dry a little for 10 to 20 minutes before twisting, so they stretch a little less in the process. To go along with those ropes on the lieutenant, I gave him a shoulder cape, being inspired by seeing them in Astartes. I kept it simple by first rolling out green stuff, then from that I cut out a quarter circle pattern. Just laid it onto the model, pressed it into place at a few points with some tools, and very gently pushed a few light folds into it so it wasn't completely flat. I also cut a bit from the rolled out green stuff and pulled it until it tore, to lay it over the shoulders of the standard bearer, to act as a kind of torn flag or parchment piece, inspired by some other Mark Gibbons art and Black Templar upgrade kit parts. Then, finally, I also made some purity seals, by cutting the rolled out green stuff into thin strips for the scripture parts, and for the wax seal I rolled some very small green stuff balls and pressed them down with the flat end of a 1 to 2mm drill piece. And once again referencing some Mark Gibbons art, but also some details I've seen in Space Marine 2 and the Secret Level episode, I wrapped some longer scripture parts around the right forearm of the standard bearer. As you can probably see, my green stuff details aren't perfect, with inconsistencies and weird sizes, especially compared to plastic versions of them. But this is the first time I've tried to make a lot of these details. With more practice and better sculpting skills, they will likely turn out much better. With that part done, the models themselves were pretty much built, and I start on the bases. With all their held out weapons and shields, there wasn't a whole lot of space on their bases, and given half had tactical rocks, I couldn't easily add much beneath them either. They'd also get the red texture paste like my other units in the army, so I stuck with some simple dead enemy bits, mostly taken from the Battlefield Trophies kit, and mostly matching the enemies they fight in the things I took inspiration from. The Tyranid Hunter got the head of the Termagant I chopped up for the armour. The Axe Wielder got some deformed and bird skulls to match the Chaos Cultists and Tzeentch Demons from Secret Level and Space Marine 2. And similarly, the Standard Bearer got a Rubric Marine helmet. And the Lieutenant got a Necron head. Not particularly matching anything, but that base detail came with the model anyway. I don't usually talk about how I specifically prep and prime my minis, but it might be helpful. I start working at the sub-assemblies for the models, and drill in small holes out of sight to glue in paperclip wire. That wire is used to hold up the model in these parts holders made from clamping down crocodile clips onto bamboo skewers, which are held in this pad of glued together cardboard strips. It allows me to pick up pieces and hit them from all angles with spray paint. It's a cheap and effective thing I made for myself for painting Gunpla with, but I found very useful for Warhammer 2. And onto the painting. I went into a lot of detail on what is pretty much the exact same scheme in my last video, so I'm going to keep it a bit more brief here, but check out my Crusader Squad breakdown if you want to hear a bit more about the specific hows and whys. I start with the dark black primer Chaos Black, onto which I dry brush the slightly lighter Corvus Black. Then, a bit more lightly, I dry brush the dark grey Eshin Grey, and then I lightly dry brush with Dawnstone, specifically brushing from the top down to hit the upper edges for a very rough highlight. With that quick initial pass for the black armour done with dry brushing, I move on to painting the other colours with the more standard method of multiple thin coats. I use 2 thin coats' Surcoat Silver for metallic parts like weapons and chains. I use Corn Red for the weapon bodies, Purity Seal stamps and some other decorations. Then, for all the tabards, cloth and scripture parts, I use a few thin coats of Rakarth flesh. That paint in particular is very useful as it has good coverage, so I like to use it for this stuff, but also for a preparatory coat for any light colours like white, so they need less coats of that other paint later. And the other main colours were just Runelord Brass for all the trim and ornaments, Dryad Bark for all the leather parts like pouches and belts, Jacero Orange for the eye lenses, and Pro Acryl's Bold Titanium White for the base of the tilt shields and the inner parts of the shoulders. But, where possible, I already primed the shoulders separately with White Scar spray paint. Those are a part where my scheme does differ from the official Black Templar heraldry, as veterans are supposed to have black shoulder pads with red trim. I made the change because I feel the whites of the shoulders bring an important balance to the overall scheme. Black Templars have had Crusade-specific heraldry minor variations before, so if you need a lore-friendly reason, it can just be my units are from a specific Crusade fleet force which have that difference. But, with the main parts done, I could move on to smaller areas and specific details. The Tyranid parts were 3 coats of Magos purple for the shell, and some very thinned down Volupus pink over Screamer skull for the flesh. For the orange-red glow of the Volkite gun, I painted the area with a thinned down white so it would settle more in the recesses, and I went over that later with Magmadroth Flame Contrast, which is what I also used to go over the helmet lenses with. And the tilt shields were just painting red halves, quarters and lines over the white base, using Mephiston Red. Then I could add the decals, for things like the banner, the chapter logos on the shoulders, Crusade seals on the legs and tilt shields. They're very handy for adding small details pretty quickly for the more intricate Crusade marks of the tilt shield, but also for things like small bits of writing on any particularly plain armour pieces, like I've seen in Space Marine 2. I looked for appropriate decals from all the sheets I'd collected from various Space Marine and even Imperial Knight kits, but most came from the Black Templar decal sheet and similarly styled ones I bought from the Mighty Brush. I applied the decals with the full thorough method, starting with preparing the areas with a gloss coat, then soaking the decals in water before transferring them onto the model, followed up by going over them with decal softener so they fully conform to the model's surface. Then, once dried, I went over them with a matte coat to remove any shininess, and I finally painted over any noticeable edges with the original paint colour of the surface underneath. At this point, I also started on painting the bases, keeping it simple and matching my other Black Templars by painting any rocks and doing a coat of Doomball Brown to stop any of the black plastic showing up under the next step, which is a layer of Martian Ironcrest. Then, with all that in place, I could shade the base, model and decals to help them match somewhat colour-wise, and also to give depth to the model by making the more recessed areas darker. I like to mix my washes, but still try to match the colour of what's being shaded most of the time by using more of a specific wash in the mix. I use Army Painter's Dark Tone, Strong Tone and Flesh Wash, using more of the black dark tone for silver areas, more of the brown strong tone for leather, tabard and red parts, and more of the ochre flesh wash for the gold and white parts. Then I also use a mix of the strong tone and flesh wash to shade the bases. And to finish off the bases, I just dry brush it with Jacaro Orange, which I also do to the bottom of the model's feet and legs to give them a slight dusty look. From here, all that was left was cleaning up any mistakes, minor details and highlighting. For the scripture on the parchment part of Purity Seals, I scribbled on a few lines using a very fine tipped pen. For a slight and subtle energy effect on the weapons, I painted zigzags with a lighter silver and went over the area with athematic blue contrast, and I also used a bit of the effect paint Blood for the Blood God in and around the wounds of the dead Tyranid head. And the highlighting was mostly just edge highlighting, painting over the edges and upper facing areas with brighter colours so they look like they're catching more light or just stand out a bit more. Sometimes just using the original paint works, as the version on the model has been darkened a bit by the shade, but also just using a lighter shade of the paint is a good option. I used Tooth & Coates' Mithril Blade to highlight the rivets and any silver, Wazdaka Red for the reds, Canoptic Alloy for the gold, Mornfang Brown for the leather, and Dawnstone for the black armour, but also using the even brighter Administratum Grey for the most upper edges and corners. And that's how I made these Black Templar Bladeguards. A more detailed squad and character to go along with my latest addition to the army, making use of more bits and a few different techniques. Some parts worked well, some not so well, but the practice is good and it's encouraged me to try it again, and open up more ways to detail future models. For my next build, I'll be finishing up this batch of Black Templars with something big that I've been wanting to try and build for a while, so keep an eye out for it. And if you want to see my progress between videos, I post more regularly on Twitter, Instagram and a few other places, all linked to in the description. And if you want to support me more directly, I have a Patreon, where supporters get weekly project updates, posts about future build ideas, a look at future plans, early access to videos and finished model pictures, and more. And I'd like to thank those currently supporting me on Patreon, who are Kyra, The Lich's Laboratory, Philip Mitchell, Talleyrand, Quirky Perceptions, and Brandon Diorley.